I've been stood up before. I want to say that up front, because the way this story ends, you might think I'm the kind of woman who falls apart at the first sign of inconvenience. I'm not. I'm Maya Chen, 34 years old, senior architect at Harman & Voss Design in Chicago, the woman who redesigned the waterfront district of an entire city block on 4 hours of sleep and a thermos of bad coffee. I don't fall apart. What I do, what I have always done, is hold myself so tightly together that sometimes I forget there's something worth holding on to in the first place. That's the real confession here. Not that I got stood up on a Tuesday afternoon in a bookstore cafe that smelled of cinnamon and old paperbacks. The real confession is that part of me was relieved when she didn't show, because it meant I could go home to my clean apartment and my drafted floor plans and my life that fit perfectly inside the lines I'd drawn for it. My best friend Jade had signed me up for the blind date without fully asking. That's a polite way of saying she created a profile for me on an app called Chapter 2, a dating platform run through local independent bookstores designed for people who, in Jade's words, have good taste and bad luck. And I'd called her exactly 3 names when I found out, and then I'd agreed to go, because Jade has a way of making you feel that refusing her is somehow a moral failing. The date was arranged for 2:15 on a Tuesday at Finch & Reed, a 2-story bookstore on Wicker Park, with mismatched armchairs and a coffee bar tucked between the poetry section and the graphic novels. I arrived at 2:13. I sat at the table by the window because the light there was good. I ordered a cortado. I smoothed the front of my blazer, checked my phone twice, and then placed it face down on the table. A discipline I developed specifically for situations where I know I'll be tempted to use it as a social shield. 2:15 came and went like a polite guest at a party. Noticed, acknowledged, gone. 2:20 arrived, and I drank a third of my cortado. 2:25, and I started reading the spines of the books on the nearest shelf, which is something I do when I need to feel anchored to a place without making it obvious I'm waiting. By 2:30, I had mentally drafted a very composed, entirely unbothered message to send through the app. Something like, "Seems like we had a miscommunication about timing. No worries at all. Totally dignified." Totally not the message of a woman who had spent 40 minutes that morning deciding between 2 different shades of rust-red lipstick. I had folded my napkin into a neat square and was reaching for my phone when the sound hit me. Not a voice exactly. More like a certainty walking across the floor. She was 6 years old, maybe. Small enough that the wooden chair backs were level with her shoulders. Big enough that she navigated the cafe with the focused authority of someone who had important business to conduct. She had dark curly hair pulled into 2 uneven puffs, a corduroy jacket the color of mustard, and she was looking directly at me with eyes so deliberately serious they made the whole room feel like it had gotten quieter. She stopped in front of my table. She looked at the empty chair across from mine. She looked back at me. There was a gravity to this child that I was entirely unprepared for on a Tuesday afternoon. "Are you Maya?" she asked. Her voice was clear and careful, the way children speak when they've been given instructions they are determined to execute correctly. I said yes. Something about the way she'd asked made it feel like a question with consequences. She gave a small, solemn nod, the kind that belongs on the face of someone delivering news they were asked to deliver carefully. And then she said the words that have lived in my chest like a splinter ever since. "Sorry, my mommy was getting pretty for you." She said it with complete sincerity, with the total earnestness of a child who understood the weight of an apology, but not yet the weight of what she'd just handed me. I stared at her. The cafe kept moving around us. The espresso machine hissed. Someone laughed 2 tables over. A chair scraped against the floor. And I just stared at this small, serious child who was looking at me like she'd completed her mission and was waiting for a receipt. And then I looked up. The door to Finch & Reed was still swinging slightly, and in its frame stood a woman who was clearly mid-arrival, mid-breath, and mid-something else I didn't have a word for yet. She was tall, dark-haired, wearing a coat with one collar slightly more flipped than the other, and she had the expression of someone who had sprinted the last 2 blocks and was choosing not to acknowledge it. Her lipstick was a deep plum, applied recently, maybe in a car mirror or a phone camera, and there was one curl at her left temple that hadn't quite made it into the loose knot at the back of her head. She was scanning the room. When her eyes found me, she stopped. Not the stopping of someone who's found what they're looking for. The stopping of someone who has found something and doesn't yet know what to do with the finding. She walked toward the table. I noticed she walked the way some people talk, fully committed to wherever she was going, no hesitation in the stride, even when the expression above it held all the hesitation in the world. She reached us and looked down at the girl, her daughter, clearly, unmistakably, with a look equal parts exasperation and the specific tenderness parents develop for children who consistently embarrass them with the truth. "Rosie," she said quietly, and the name alone carried about 6 chapters of a story I didn't know yet. The girl, Rosie, turned to her mother with perfect innocence and said, "I told her, like you said." And the woman closed her eyes for just a moment, 1 second, and I watched something move across her face that I didn't have the context to name. Then she looked at me. Really looked. The kind that doesn't slide off the surface of a person. "I'm Nora," she said. "Nora Vasquez. God, I'm so sorry." We had a small coat-related crisis in the car, and then parking was... She stopped, started again. "I'm late. I know I'm late. And apparently my daughter has been acting as my publicist." Rosie nodded, unbothered. I felt something loosen in my chest, not dramatically, not like a wall coming down. More like a single brick shifting slightly, just enough to let in a current of air. I said something politely gracious, architecturally composed, something that belonged to the version of me who folds napkins into neat squares. But what I was thinking, underneath all of that careful architecture, was something I hadn't expected to think that afternoon. I was thinking, stay. Not to her. To myself. A small, private instruction to the part of me already calculating exits. I looked at Nora Vasquez standing at the edge of my table with her crooked collar and her plum lipstick, and her daughter who apologized on her behalf with complete moral seriousness, and I thought, stay in the room. Just this once, stay in the room. And I pulled out the chair, and she sat down. And Rosie climbed into the chair beside her like she owned a third of the table, which, in a way, she did. The afternoon light shifted through the bookstore window and landed across all 3 of us, and the espresso machine hissed again. And the story that no list, no app, no carefully managed life had prepared me for, began. Rosie fell asleep between a shelf of picture books and a beanbag chair the color of a ripe avocado, with her mustard corduroy jacket folded under her cheek like a pillow she'd planned all along. One moment she was narrating, with full documentary authority, the plot of a book about a bear who opened a bakery, and the next she was simply gone, surrendered to sleep the way only children can, without negotiation, without transition, without any of the self-consciousness that makes adults lie awake, cataloging everything they said wrong that day. Nora watched her settle, and something in her face shifted. Not softened, exactly, because it was already soft when she looked at her daughter. It was more like a door closing quietly in a house that was otherwise full of open windows. She turned back to me and said, almost to herself, "She does that, 0 to unconscious in 40 seconds. I looked at Rosie's small face, perfectly still, and felt something I couldn't immediately account for. Not tenderness, not exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood. We ordered more coffee. That was the decision that changed everything, though I didn't know it yet. The simple, unremarkable act of Nora catching the eye of the barista and holding up 2 fingers, and me not stopping her, not saying, actually, I should get going, not executing the polite exit I had already drafted in the architectural drafting room of my mind. I stayed because the cortado was good, I stayed because Rosie was asleep, and it seemed rude to leave a sleeping child. I stayed because Nora Vasquez had just finished telling me that she once splinted a toddler's broken finger using 2 popsicle sticks and medical tape in the back of a lift, and I needed to hear how that story ended. The truth is, I stayed because something about the way she sat, slightly forward, elbows on the table, entirely unguarded, made retreat feel like the lesser option. That was new. Retreat has almost always been my best option. She was a pediatrician, board-certified, 8 years in practice, specialized in developmental delays and early childhood diagnostics. She'd been at Northwestern Memorial for 3 years before accepting a temporary placement at Lurie Children's Hospital. 4 months, covering a leave of absence for a colleague. After that, Portland. A permanent position at OHSU, a city she'd visited twice, a life she'd accepted in principle, but hadn't yet made real in her mind. She told me all of this the way people tell you facts about themselves when they haven't yet decided how much of the story underneath the facts they're willing to share. Efficiently, accurately, with a slight forward lean that suggested she was more interested in the next question than the answer she'd just given. I recognized the technique. I use it constantly. I recognized it and said nothing and filed it somewhere important. "And you design buildings," she said. Not a question. She'd read my profile on the app, presumably, but not quite a statement either. More like an observation she was still deciding what to do with. Specifically, I told her, I design the spaces between buildings. The way a corridor makes you feel before you reach the room. The way a staircase changes your relationship to a floor you've already been on. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I would spend the next several weeks trying to accurately decode. Part curiosity, part something more careful. And then she said, "So you think about how people move through space?" I said yes. She said, "That's what I do too. I just do it with kids who don't have the language to tell me where it hurts yet." I heard that sentence land somewhere in me, and felt the reverberation of it long after the words were gone. We disagreed about almost everything structural. She was chaos forward, her word, delivered without apology, the kind of person who booked flights the week of, who cooked without recipes, who had moved to Chicago with 60 boxes and no furniture plan because, she said, "Rooms tell you where things want to go if you give them a minute." I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that rooms do not want anything, that rooms are inert, and that the function of good design is to anticipate human behavior so thoroughly that the room appears to want things when in fact it is simply well considered. She smiled when I said that. Not the smile of someone being polite, the smile of someone who has just found a thread they intend to pull. "You've thought about this a lot," she said. "I've thought about everything a lot," I said. And she laughed, full and unguarded, the kind that uses the whole body. And something in my chest did the thing again. The brick, the air. The cafe began to thin out around us. The afternoon light changed quality, lost its directness, became the lateral golden kind that makes everything look like it's being remembered rather than experienced. A barista started wiping down the tables near the window. Neither of us moved. Rosie slept on, authoritative even in unconsciousness. Nora was telling me about the winter she and Rosie had spent in a studio apartment in Minneapolis while she finished a fellowship, how they had made a game of the smallness. How every piece of furniture was also something else. How the bathtub had briefly served as a ball pit. How Rosie had decided the closet was a restaurant and charged imaginary admission. I was listening in the way I almost never listen, which is without any part of my attention already composing my next sentence. I was just there. It was disorienting. It was not unpleasant. Then it happened. The thing I would replay later with the obsessive precision of someone studying architectural drawings for a structural flaw. We both reached for the coffee at the same time. Her cup was in front of her and mine was in front of me. There was no logical reason for our hands to occupy the same geography. But somehow they did. The backs of our fingers touched. Not dramatically, not for long. The duration of a reflex, maybe half a second. We both pulled back. We both looked at the cups, not at each other. The espresso machine chose that exact moment to be silent. I became extremely interested in the grain of the wooden table. Nora picked up her cup and drank from it with the focused attention of someone performing a very ordinary action very deliberately. Neither of us said anything. Neither of us needed to. That was the moment I understood, with the same clarity I have when a blueprint finally resolves, when the measurements align and the structure that was only concept becomes something that could hold weight, that I was in trouble. Not bad trouble necessarily. Not the kind I could design my way around. The kind that arrives without asking and rearranges the furniture of a life that was previously in perfect order. I looked at Nora Vasquez, and I thought about the 4 months sitting between us like a load-bearing wall. Thought about Portland. Thought about the very specific way I had broken apart the last time I let someone rearrange me. And then I thought about the backs of our fingers and the half-second of contact that had felt, absurdly, like a conversation. I thought, this is a terrible idea. I thought it with complete sincerity and absolute certainty. And I did not leave. Rosie woke up at 5:47 with perfect dramatic timing, sat up straight in the beanbag, and announced that she was hungry and that she wanted soup. Nora looked at her daughter with the expression of someone who has long accepted that this small person operates on a schedule entirely her own, and then she looked at me, and there was a question in the look that she didn't ask out loud. I am an architect. I read structures. I read that question clearly. There's a Vietnamese place 2 blocks down, I said. They do a piho that Rosie would probably call the best soup in the world. Rosie turned to me immediately. Is it the best soup in the world? She asked, with the directness of someone who has no interest in marketing. It might be, I said. She considered this. She nodded. Okay, she said, and stood up and put on her jacket with the certainty of someone whose decision had just become everyone's plan. We walked the 2 blocks in the early November cold, Rosie between us, holding both our hands without asking, as if this was simply the configuration that made sense. The street was loud and bright and indifferent to everything happening inside me. Nora's shoulder was close to mine. Our breath made brief clouds in the cold air that merged for a second before dissolving. I was thinking about the 4 months. I was thinking about Portland. I was thinking about the very particular feeling of standing inside a building you designed and realizing too late that you forgot to leave yourself a door. And I was thinking about Rosie's hand in mine. Small and warm and completely trusting, and how that trust felt like something I had no architecture for and no desire, for the first time in a very long time, to build a wall against. I have a rule about mornings. It's not written anywhere, not part of any list, but it functions with the reliability of a structural code. The first hour of the day belongs entirely to me. Coffee, silence, the drafting table by the east window, where the light comes in at the angle that makes everything look solvable. No phone, no email, no conversation that requires me to be fully assembled before I've had the chance to assemble myself. I built this rule after the end of my last relationship, when I realized that I had spent 2 years organizing my mornings around another person's rhythms, around Elena's coffee order and Elena's playlists, and Elena's talent for filling every quiet space with noise that felt, at the time, like companionship, and that I understood only afterward as occupation. When Elena left, not dramatically, not with a scene, just with a suitcase and a note that said I need a life that breathes, as if mine had been suffocating her, I reclaimed my mornings the way you reclaim a room after someone has lived in it, methodically, completely, with fresh paint. The problem with Nora Vasquez was that she started showing up in my mornings without being physically present. That's the more insidious version of intrusion. Not the kind that announces itself at your door, but the kind that sits quietly in the corner of your kitchen while you're making coffee. Not speaking. Just existing in your peripheral vision, until you make the mistake of turning to look directly at it. 7 days after the bookstore, I was at my drafting table at 6:40 in the morning, reviewing load calculations for a mixed-use development in Logan Square, and I found myself thinking about the way Nora had described her daughter's laugh, like a sneeze she can't stop. And I had to set my pencil down and look out the window for a moment, because I had just smiled at an empty room, and that is not something I do. I catalog it here because accuracy matters. The intrusion began small. It always does. We had not made plans. That's what I told myself was happening. Not a series of dates, not a developing pattern, just an accumulation of coincidences shaped by a neighborhood that was smaller than it appeared. The Vietnamese restaurant on Tuesday had ended with Rosie declaring Pho to be probably the best soup, but not definitely, which I respected enormously. On Thursday, I ran into them at the farmers market on Milwaukee Avenue, Nora bargaining with absolute confidence over the price of persimmons, Rosie standing beside her eating a sample of goat cheese with the focused appreciation of a professional judge. On Saturday, Nora texted. My number had migrated from the app to her phone somewhere between the PHO and the persimmons. To say that Rosie had decided I needed to see the lake in November, because apparently I had mentioned I rarely went, and Rosie had filed this information, and considered it a problem requiring correction. I went. We walked the lakefront for 2 hours in coats that were not warm enough, and Rosie narrated the experience like a nature documentary, and Nora walked beside me with her hands in her pockets, and her shoulder occasionally finding mine when the path narrowed, and I did not move away. Each time I did not move away, I registered it as data without knowing yet what the data meant. What I noticed, empirically and against my preferences, was the way Nora occupied space, not aggressively. She wasn't someone who needed to fill a room, wasn't loud in that particular way that announces itself as personality. She was present. Fully, specifically present in whatever moment she was in the way that made the moment feel more inhabited. When she listened to you, she listened with her entire face, not just her eyes. There was something that shifted in her jaw, in the set of her shoulders, that communicated a quality of attention I had rarely been on the receiving end of without immediately becoming suspicious of it. With Elena, attention had always carried a cost I discovered only after I'd accepted it. With Nora, attention felt like weather, not directed at me as transaction, just present the way rain is present, indifferent to whether or not you'd planned for it. I found this simultaneously disarming and alarming. Most things that disarmed me also alarmed me. I had come to accept this as a feature of my emotional architecture rather than a flaw. Rosie, for her part, was conducting her own separate campaign that I was not fully aware of until it was well advanced. She asked me questions with the methodical persistence of a researcher who suspects the data is more interesting than the subject is letting on. What did I build? Did buildings have feelings? Had I ever made a mistake and had to knock something down? Did I live alone? Did I like living alone? Did I have a cat? Why didn't I have a cat? She asked this last question with the specific gravity of someone who believed the answer would be clarifying. And when I said that my life didn't have room for a cat's needs right now, she looked at me for a long moment and said, "My mom used to say that. She says it differently now." I glanced at Nora, who was looking at a display of winter squash with sudden intense interest. I stored that sentence in the same place I was storing everything that happened when these two were nearby, in the part of me that was building a case I hadn't yet decided what to do with. The flashback comes whether I invite it or not. It has a way of arriving sideways, through details. The particular slant of late afternoon light, the smell of coffee cooling in a cup, the sound of someone moving through a kitchen on the other side of a wall. Elena and I had met at a design conference in Barcelona, which sounds romantic and was, at first, the sustained romance of two ambitious women who recognized in each other a matching hunger and mistook recognition for compatibility. We were together for 2 years and 4 months. She was a landscape architect from São Paulo, brilliant in the specific way that makes a person compelling from the outside and difficult to fully reach from the inside. I loved her with the same methodical intensity I bring to everything. Completely, according to plan, with contingencies built in for the variables I could predict. What I had not built a contingency for was the specific way a person can decide, quietly and privately, over the course of months you thought were good months, that the structure you've built together is not the structure they want to live inside. The note said, "I need a life that breathes." I have spent considerable time since then, wondering what it was about the life I offered that felt airless. I have not arrived at a satisfying answer. I have arrived at walls. On the 11th day after the bookstore, Nora called instead of texting. I was at my desk at the office, reviewing revised schematics for the Logan Square project, and her name on my phone screen produced a response in my chest that was disproportionate to the situation, and that I noted with the concern of someone monitoring a structural anomaly. She called to ask if I knew anything about Chicago public schools, enrollment windows, neighborhood boundaries, whether Lincoln Elementary was as good as the internet suggested, because Rosie's temporary school situation was becoming complicated, and she was drowning in administrative language she didn't understand. I knew. Of course I knew. I designed 2 school renovation projects in the city and had absorbed its educational geography as professional context. I spent 20 minutes on the phone walking her through district boundaries and waitlist protocols, and at the end she said, "Maya, I don't know what I would do without you in this city." She said it lightly, practically, as a statement of logistical gratitude. I said something easy in return. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand and looked at the drafting on my screen and thought about what she'd said, specifically about the phrase "without you in this city," and about the 4 months, and about Portland, and about the way that phrase had the exact shape of something I was not going to be able to unfeel. It was Jade who named what was happening before I did, which is Jade's specific gift and her most reliable quality. We met for dinner that Wednesday, a Thai place near her apartment in Bucktown, and I gave her the facts without editorializing, the way I give anyone facts when I am hoping the facts will speak for themselves, and I won't have to speak for them. Jade let me finish. She picked up her spring roll. She set it down. She said, "You're falling for her." I said I was not falling for anyone. I said I was simply navigating a new friendship with someone who happened to be temporary. Jade looked at me with the patience of someone who has known me for 11 years and has watched me name every feeling I've ever had as something more manageable than the feeling actually was. She said, "Maya, you just spent 8 minutes describing the way she laughs." I had not realized I'd done that. The data was significant. I drove home that night through streets that were beginning to carry the particular cold of a Chicago November, the kind with teeth, the kind that changes the quality of the dark. And I thought about what Jade had said, and about the series of moments that had accumulated over 11 days without my fully authorizing them. The farmer's market, the lake, the Poe, the phone call about school districts, the way Rosie had taken my hand on that first sidewalk without asking. I thought about my mornings and the presence that had started occupying the corner of them. And I thought about the thing I had promised myself after Elena, the private, load-bearing promise that I would not invest myself in a direction I could already see the end of. Nora had 4 months. I could see the end clearly, specifically, the way I can see the terminus of any structure from the blueprint. The intelligent thing, the architecturally sound thing, was to recognize the limitation before I'd gone too far into the build. I told myself this with complete seriousness. I believed it with the sincerity of someone who has confused self-protection with wisdom so many times that the two have become genuinely indistinguishable. I turned onto my street. I parked. I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, and then my phone lit up with a photo from Nora. Rosie asleep again, this time with a library book open across her chest, title visible, "The Bear Who Built Things." The caption said only, "She picked it herself, thought you should know." I looked at that photo for a long time in the dark of my car. The brick shifted. The air came in. I went upstairs and I did not build a single wall that night. The call came at 11:40 on a Thursday night, which is the specific hour when the city has gotten quiet enough that your phone ringing sounds like an emergency, even when it isn't. I was at my drafting table, still, again, always, working through a revision on the Logan Square project that my project director Marcus had flagged that afternoon, with the particular energy of someone who is trying to be diplomatic and failing. The revision was structural, load-bearing in the literal sense, the kind that requires the quality of attention that crowds everything else out. I was in that state, the one where the problem on the table is the only thing that exists. When my phone rang, and Nora's name appeared on the screen, and something in me went immediately, quietly alert in a way that had nothing to do with architecture. I answered on the second ring. I would later note that I had never, in 11 days, let any of her calls reach the third. Her voice was composed in the way that people are composed when they are holding something carefully and don't want you to hear the effort of the holding. Rosie had a fever, 102.4, climbing. The pediatric after-hours line had told her what she already knew as a doctor, which was that it was likely viral and manageable at home. But knowing a thing medically and living it parentally are two different countries with the same name. The babysitter had canceled that morning, a family thing, genuinely unavoidable, and Nora had rearranged her Thursday around it. But now it was nearly midnight, and Rosie was asking for soup, and the one grocery store within walking distance that carried the specific broth Rosie would accept was closed, and Nora's car was in the shop until tomorrow, and she had called 3 people before me. She said that last part quickly, the way people flag something when they're worried you'll read it wrong. I called 3 people before you, she said, and I want you to know that, because I don't want you to feel... She stopped. I said, text me your address. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Maya. Just my name. The way she said it, low, careful, with something underneath it that she wasn't finishing, did something to the quality of the air in my apartment. Text me your address, I said again. She did. I knew where the 24-hour grocery on North Avenue was because I had designed the residential complex above it 2 years earlier, and the knowledge of a neighborhood's infrastructure stays with you the way the knowledge of a building's bones stays with you. Permanently, spatially, available without retrieval. I bought the broth, the specific kind. She'd texted the brand. And crackers and children's acetaminophen and a thing of fresh ginger, because I know what my mother made when I had fevers as a child, and I don't question instincts that come from that particular archive. I drove to her address, a 3-flat in Andersonville, 2nd floor, the kind of building with good bones and landlord-deferred maintenance that gave it the look of something that had weathered things and not quite recovered. The buzzer sounded before I finished pressing it. She was waiting. The apartment was small and warm, and absolutely, completely Nora, which is to say it was organized in the way that suggested an intelligent person had made considered decisions about where things went, and then a 6-year-old had introduced ongoing amendments to every single one of them. There were drawings on the refrigerator, 12 or 15 of them, held up with an assortment of magnets that appeared to have been collected from every city Rosie had ever been in. There was a bookshelf with books arranged partially by color and partially by a system that appeared to be Rosie's, and that I could not decode. There were small shoes near the door, placed with the haphazardness of someone who had removed them mid-movement, going somewhere more important than shoe organization. It looked lived in the specific way that makes a space feel inhabited rather than occupied. I had a sudden, sharp awareness of my own apartment, its clean surfaces, its deliberate arrangement, its quality of a place that housed one person and had been designed to make that fact feel like sufficiency. Standing in Nora's hallway, I felt the difference between the two spaces in a way I hadn't anticipated and couldn't immediately classify. Rosie was on the couch under a blanket that had a pattern of small yellow stars, flushed and heavy-eyed but deeply undefeated by the fever, which had come down to 101.1 since Nora had given her a half dose of the medication they had. She looked at me when I came in with the bags and said, with the gravity of a person who has been ill for several hours and feels this should be acknowledged. I have a fever. I told her I'd heard and that I'd brought the soup. She considered this. Is it the right kind? I showed her the carton. She looked at it with the critical attention of a small sommelier and gave a single nod of acceptance. Nora was standing in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen, watching this exchange with an expression I had to look away from because it was too much of something I didn't have a container for yet. I made the soup. That is a simple sentence for something that felt, in the doing of it, not simple at all. Nora's kitchen was narrow, 2 people wide at most, and Nora stood at the counter while I worked the stove, and we talked in the low voices that apartments use late at night, the kind of conversation that happens when the hour has stripped away the social scaffolding and left only the actual exchange. She talked about her residency years, the sleep deprivation, the specific loneliness of being the only one in a room who knew exactly how bad a situation was. I talked about the early years at Harman and Voss, the projects I'd taken on to prove something to people who hadn't asked for proof, the way ambition can function as a very elegant avoidance strategy if you let it. We were not performing for each other. That was the thing. After 32 days of accumulating careful impressions, of presenting the considered versions of ourselves, this kitchen at midnight was something else. Smaller, truer, lit by the stove light, and the fact that Rosie needed soup, and there was no audience, and no architecture for anything except what was actually happening. At some point, without planning it, I turned from the stove and Nora was closer than I expected. The kitchen was narrow, I've said that, but this was something beyond the kitchen's dimensions. Something in the way she'd moved, or I had, or we both had, through the small choreography of 2 people sharing a space that was built for one. We were perhaps 8 inches apart. I could see the specific tiredness in her face, not the managed fatigue she presented to the world, but the real kind, the kind that lives under the eyes and at the corners of the mouth and tells you what a person costs themselves. I could see the plum of her lipstick worn down to almost nothing, just a shadow of it at the center of her lip. I could see her looking at me with an attention that was different from every other time she'd looked at me. And I understood, with the same precise clarity I have when a structure resolves, that what was happening in this kitchen was something that had been building since the bookstore, since the coffee, since the fingers touching the cup, since Rosie's hand in mine on the sidewalk. The pot began to steam. Neither of us moved. The city outside was completely quiet. 8 inches felt like the distance between a decision and its consequences. It was Rosie who broke it, calling from the couch in the frayed, imperious voice of a sick child who has waited long enough. "Is the soup ready?" And Nora and I both exhaled at the same moment, and she turned to check on her daughter, and I turned back to the stove, and the 8 inches returned to being merely a measurement. But something had been established that could not be unestablished. That's the thing about structures. Once you've understood the load they're carrying, you cannot look at them the same way again. I ladled the soup into a bowl and carried it to Rosie, and sat on the edge of the coffee table while she ate it with the focused appreciation of someone who had earned it. Nora sat on the other end of the couch, her feet tucked under her, watching her daughter with the expression that I had come to understand was her most private face. The one she didn't compose for anyone, the one that simply happened when she was looking at the person she loved most in the world. Rosie finished the soup and fell asleep with the speed she always fell asleep, mid-sentence, the spoon still in her hand. Nora extracted it carefully and pulled the star blanket up and sat back, and we were quiet together in the way that 2 people are quiet when they have passed through something and arrived on the other side of it without fully discussing the crossing. I should have left. It was after 1 in the morning. I had a 7:30 meeting. The Logan Square revision was unfinished on my drafting table. Every structural argument I had built pointed toward the door. Instead, I said, "Tell me something you've never told anyone in a city you didn't plan to stay in." It was an unusual thing to say, and I said it anyway, because the hour had done what late hours do, dissolved the caution between the words I prepared and the words that were actually true. Nora looked at me for a moment. Then she said, I think I stayed in every city wrong. I kept waiting for the city to tell me I belonged there, and it never did. I thought that was the city's fault. She paused. I don't think that anymore. I sat with what she'd said and felt it settle somewhere that wasn't available for architectural revision. Outside, Chicago was dark and cold and entirely indifferent to the two of us on that couch, and Rosie breathed her slow, even breath between us like a small fact of life. And I thought, this is something that shouldn't be happening. And then I thought, with a quietness that scared me more than anything else had, but it is happening. It absolutely, completely is. There is a specific kind of person who enters a room and recalibrates it without appearing to try. Dominique Reyes was that kind of person, and I say this not as a compliment and not as a criticism, but as an observation with the precision of someone who has spent 11 years studying how structures affect the people inside them. She was 41, a principal at an urban planning firm in the West Loop, tall in the way that announces itself before height is actually registered, with the particular self-possession of a woman who had decided somewhere in her 30s exactly who she was and had not revisited the question since. We had worked adjacent projects twice, a mixed-use corridor development in 2019, a transit-oriented design competition in 2021 that her firm won and mine placed second in. And for approximately 8 months between those two projects, we had been something that neither of us had named, which was, in retrospect, the most accurate description of what it was. She was direct, cerebral, relentlessly capable, and she kissed like someone solving a problem they were confident they could solve. When it ended, mutually, cleanly, without damage, I had filed her under necessary experience and considered the matter resolved. She reappeared on a Monday morning in November like a structural calculation I thought I'd closed. The email came to my work address, which was professional and appropriate, and also notable, because Dominique had my personal number and chose not to use it, which meant she was proposing something that required the frame of the professional before it revealed whatever else it was carrying. The email was about a public-private partnership project, a new mixed-income residential development on the near north side, the kind of project that comes along twice in a career if you're fortunate, the kind that gets published in architectural journals and changes the conversation about a neighborhood for a generation. Her firm had the planning commission relationship. My firm had the design reputation. The proposal was a joint bid. It was, professionally, an extraordinary opportunity. I read the email twice, and then I read the last line twice more, which said, "I'd love to discuss over dinner. If you're open to it, I think this could be something significant for both of us." The word both was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and I noted it the way I note weight distribution in a load-bearing element, carefully, with attention to what happens if it shifts. I told Jade about it that afternoon, framed as a professional question, because Jade is also an architect, residential, independent practice, and I needed her assessment of the opportunity itself before I could trust my own, which I suspected was compromised by factors I wasn't ready to name out loud. Jade listened to the professional version of the situation, with the patience of someone waiting for the personal version to arrive, and when I finished, she said, "Is this the same Dominique?" I said yes. She said, "And you're going to dinner." I said I was considering it as a professional meeting. She looked at me with 11 years of knowing me arranged in her expression and said, "Maya, you've been describing a woman you're terrified of wanting for 3 weeks. Now your ex-not-girlfriend appears with a career-defining project. You understand what's happening here." I said I understood it was a coincidence of timing. Jade said, "There are no coincidences. There are only tests and the results of tests." This is the kind of thing Jade says, and the reason I keep her in my life is that she is usually, irritatingly, correct. I responded to Dominique's email the same day, which I told myself was because the project timeline required prompt engagement, and not because some part of me wanted to introduce a variable that would simplify the Nora equation by complicating it. We agreed on dinner that Friday at a restaurant in the West Loop, Dominique's neighborhood, her suggestion, a place with low lighting and a wine list that required commitment. I told Nora about dinner the same way I told her about most things I was uncertain about, which is to say I mentioned it in passing, texted alongside something else, gave it no more weight than it deserved. I said a colleague and I were meeting to discuss a possible joint project. I said it Friday evening. Nora said, "That sounds exciting. The near North Side thing?" I had not told her it was the near North Side. I had not told her enough for her to know that. I typed, "How did you know that?" She typed back, "I Googled the Planning Commission agenda last week. You mentioned the project and I looked it up. I sat with my phone and felt the weight of someone paying that quality of attention to something I'd said in passing. And I felt it in the place where the brick had been shifting, and I said nothing about Dominique. The dinner was exactly what I should have expected. Which is to say it was excellent, and it was complicated, and Dominique was exactly who she had always been. Precise, compelling, with the quality of certainty that makes you feel. In her presence, that uncertainty is a problem with a solution. She laid out the project with the confidence of someone who had already imagined it fully, and was now offering me the chance to join a vision already in progress. It was genuinely extraordinary. The scope, the community integration framework, the design language she was proposing that would require exactly the kind of ambitious structural thinking I was best at. She described it across the table in the low restaurant light, and I understood it immediately. The way you understand a building the moment its logic becomes visible. And I felt the specific pleasure of professional excitement that I sometimes forget is one of the cleaner things I'm capable of feeling. And then she said, in the same even tone, as if it were continuous with the project discussion, "I've missed working near you." The near was precise. She knew what she was doing with the near. I looked at her and thought about Nora, and thought about 4 months, and thought about Portland, and said, "Tell me more about the community board structure." I had not planned to invite Nora. That requires stating plainly, because the decision happened in a space between intention and impulse that I don't fully have access to even now. There was a dinner, the following Thursday, a loose gathering of colleagues from Harman and Voss and 2 urban planners from Dominique's firm, a thing Marcus had organized at a wine bar in Logan Square that was professional adjacent and social in the way that Chicago architecture circles are social, meaning that everyone is friendly, and everyone is also always slightly networking. I mentioned it to Nora on Wednesday without thinking. The way you mention things to someone who has started to occupy the daily frequency of your thinking, and she said she'd love to come if the sitter worked out, and I said great. And then I sat with the word great for approximately 40 minutes afterward, understanding what I had done. I had put Nora Vasquez in the same room as Dominique Reyes. Voluntarily, without any coherent justification. The sitter worked out. Nora arrived 20 minutes after me, which I had come to understand was simply Nora's relationship with time. Not disrespect, not carelessness, just the genuine optimism of a person who always believes she can do one more thing before leaving. She came in from the November cold with her cheeks lit from the walk, and her hair half escaped from its knot, and she found me across the room with a directness that didn't require searching. Just a scan and a landing, and something in my chest did the specific thing it did when she looked at me like that. The thing I had been carefully not naming for weeks. She made her way to me through the room, stopping twice to be introduced by Marcus, and I watched Dominique, who was standing 2 feet to my left, register Nora's arrival with the clean, analytical attention that was entirely characteristic of her. She didn't ask who Nora was. She waited. That was also characteristic. I introduced them with the neutral professionalism of someone diffusing something by pretending there is nothing to diffuse. Dominique extended her hand and said it was great to meet her, and asked how she knew Maya. And Nora said she was a friend, new to the city. And then she said, with the complete unguardedness that was one of the most disarming things about her, "She's become sort of my person in Chicago. I don't know what I'd do without her here." It was the same thing she'd said on the phone. It had the same shape as before. Dominique smiled the smile of someone filing information and said, "That's a lucky thing, having a person." Her eyes came to me briefly, precisely, and left again. Nora was looking at the wine list. I was looking at neither of them, and at both of them simultaneously, which is not architecturally possible, and yet was exactly what was happening. The evening unfolded with the specific tension of a structure carrying more load than its visible supports suggest. Nora was warm, funny, entirely herself. She got into a 20-minute conversation with one of Dominique's planners about pediatric healthcare access and urban design that had half the table leaning in. She laughed at Marcus's terrible jokes with genuine generosity. She asked Dominique a smart, pointed question about the Near North Side project's displacement mitigation plan that made Dominique look at her with new attention, and then look at me with attention of a different kind. At one point, Nora touched my arm to make a point she was making. Just a touch, fingers on my forearm, the duration of a sentence. And I felt Dominique's awareness of it, the way you feel a change in a room's temperature. Not cold, not warm. A recalibration. Later, when Nora had gone to the bar with Marcus to get another round, Dominique said to me, quietly, into the space between us where the conversation had been, "She's not just a friend." I said nothing. Dominique nodded once, with the expression of someone confirming a hypothesis. "The project offer still stands," she said, "separate from everything else. I want you to know that." I looked at her and felt the strange, vertiginous quality of being known by someone you didn't choose to be known by, in that particular way. "I know," I said. And I did. And it didn't simplify anything. The confirmation email from Portland arrived on a Tuesday, which is the least dramatic day of the week, and I have thought about that since, about how the things that change the shape of your life tend to arrive on ordinary days, in ordinary fonts, in the body of an email you open between a calendar notification and a billing reminder. Nora forwarded it to me without comment, just the email itself, the OHSU letterhead, the language about finalizing her permanent placement, the response deadline printed in a polite but unambiguous bold 10 days. I read it at my desk at Harmon and Voss on a Tuesday afternoon with the Logan Square schematics open on the screen behind it and the sounds of the office moving around me. Marcus on a call in the next room, the printer running, someone's coffee mug set down on a hard surface, and I felt the email the way you feel a load-bearing wall when it's been compromised. Not dramatically, not with sound. Just the quiet, total understanding that something that was holding weight has changed, and everything above it is now subject to revision. I called her that evening, not texted, called, which by then carried its own meaning between us. The way most things between us had accumulated meaning without our formally authorizing it. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been waiting for the call, which told me she understood what the email meant for both of us, even without the conversation we hadn't had yet. We talked around it for a few minutes. Rosie's school thing had resolved. The broth she'd bought at the grocery was the wrong brand, and Rosie had made her feelings clear. A small story about a patient that had made Nora laugh in the particular way she laughed when something moved her before it could make her sad. I listened to all of it with the attention I always gave her, and underneath the attention I was building something, assembling the architecture of what I was going to say, arranging the load so that it was distributed evenly, so that nothing collapsed. That's what I do when I'm afraid. I build, I arrange. I make the structure so sound that the fear has nowhere to stand. 10 days, I said, when the small talk had run its natural course. That's not very long. Nora was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not." Another pause, the kind that has shape and weight. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "About Portland. About what it would mean to go." She stopped. I heard the specific quality of someone stopping, because they want the other person to say something first, to offer something, to step into the space that the stopping creates. I heard it, and I understood it, and I stepped in the wrong direction entirely. I said, "Nora, you should go." The words came out with more composure than anything I'd felt in weeks, which is the most reliable sign that I am doing the thing I always do, constructing calm over the top of something that is anything but. Portland is what you planned, I said. Rosie needs stability, a permanent position, a permanent city. That's what you've been working toward. That's what makes sense. Each sentence was structurally sound. Each sentence was exactly and completely wrong. The silence that followed was different from the other silences we'd had. Those had been full, the comfortable density of two people sharing a quiet without needing to fill it. This one was empty in the specific way that something is empty when it has just been evacuated. When what was present a moment ago has withdrawn and left the air changed. I heard her breathing. I heard the city outside her window, faint and indifferent. When she spoke, her voice had changed in a way that I registered physically, somewhere behind the sternum, the way you register a frequency that's below hearing. That's what you think I should do, she said. Not a question, not quite a statement. The tone of someone repeating something back to verify that they heard it correctly and hoping they didn't. I think it makes sense, I said, which was not the same as what she'd asked, and we both knew it. Maya. Just my name again. But this time it didn't have the warmth of the kitchen at midnight. This time it had the specific weight of a name used when someone wants you to understand that they are seeing you very clearly, and that what they're seeing is not what you're showing. Are you telling me to go? She said slowly. Or are you telling me it's easier if I go? The question was precise. It was the most architecturally accurate question anyone had asked me in years, and it landed with the force of something that has found the exact point of structural vulnerability and pressed. I said, I'm telling you what's practical. She said, I didn't ask you what was practical. Her voice was quiet and even, and entirely devastated in the way that people are devastated, who have decided not to let you see the full dimension of it. I told you Portland was temporary, she said. You knew I had 4 months when we met. I knew I had 4 months. And in those 4 months something happened that She stopped. Started again. I need to know that it happened for you too. Not the practical version. Not the version that makes sense. I need to know if it was real. My chest was a construction site. Everything was load and counterload, and the fear of what collapses when you build without adequate support. I said, Nora? She said, that's not an answer. She was right. It was not an answer. It was the sound of a woman who was terrified saying a name instead of the truth, which is a thing I had done so many times it had become architectural habit, load-bearing, indistinguishable from the structure itself. What happened next was not a fight in the way fights are usually described, with elevation, with heat, with the dramatic geometry of two people in opposition. It was worse than that. It was two people who knew each other well enough to know exactly where the other was most exposed, choosing, in their separate terrors, not to go there, choosing silence and surface and the clean distance of practical language instead. Nora said she understood. She said it in the voice of someone who understands something they did not want to understand. She said she needed to think, and I said of course, and she said goodnight, and I said goodnight. And the call ended with the soft percussion of a phone disconnecting that is perhaps the least dramatic sound in the world for the amount of damage it can mark. I set my phone on the drafting table and looked at the Logan Square schematics, which were still open on my screen, and the lines of the building looked back at me with the indifference of things that do not require anything from you except accuracy. I was not accurate that night. I was the least accurate I had been in years. She did not text the next day. I told myself this was fine. She needed space, she was thinking. 10 days was enough time for both of them to think. I worked. I took 3 meetings. I ate lunch at my desk. I reviewed Dominique's project proposal, which had arrived formally that morning, and I read it with attention I had to manufacture. Because the part of my mind that was usually available for the clarity of professional work was occupied. Entirely, stubbornly, without my permission. By the specific quality of Nora's voice, when she'd said goodnight, and the precise weight of everything she had not said before it. On the second day of silence, I drafted a text 3 times and deleted it 3 times, because each version was either too much or too managed, and I could not find the middle territory between the two, which told me something about the state I was in that I preferred not to examine directly. On the 3rd day, I went to Finch and Reed, the bookstore, the table by the window, the same cortado, because I needed to be in a place that had a before, and the before of Nora and me was there, embedded in the grain of that table, the way the history of a structure is embedded in its materials. The barista who had been working that first Tuesday was there again. She didn't recognize me. The table by the window was occupied by a man with a laptop who appeared to be in the middle of something important and permanent. I sat at the counter instead, and drank my coffee, and looked at the poetry section where Rosie had fallen asleep on a Tuesday afternoon that now felt both very recent and like another life. And I thought about what Nora had asked me. Are you telling me to go? Or are you telling me it's easier if I go? I thought about Elena's note. I need a life that breathes. And about the specific architecture of how I had responded to that loss, which was to build the walls tighter and call it dignity. I thought about Rosie's drawing on the refrigerator, the 12 magnets from 12 cities, and about what Nora had said in the kitchen at midnight. I think I stayed in every city wrong. I kept waiting for the city to tell me I belonged there. I sat with all of this in the bookstore and felt the acute, specific discomfort of a person who has built a structure they can no longer comfortably live inside and does not yet know how to begin the renovation. The silence lasted 14 days. I know the number because I counted, which is not something I would normally admit, because counting is the behavior of someone who is waiting, and waiting requires hope. And hope was the thing I had been most careful to under-budget in the architecture of this particular situation. On the 14th day, a Sunday, gray, the kind of Chicago November that has given up on being anything other than what it is, I woke at 5:40 in the morning from a dream I couldn't hold on to, only the residue of it, which was Nora's voice saying something I couldn't recover, and I lay in the clean silence of my apartment and looked at the east window where the light wasn't yet, and felt the full weight of the quiet, which was different from the quiet I had built my mornings around. That quiet was chosen. This one was the result of something I had done, and the difference between chosen solitude and produced loneliness is not always visible from the inside until you're deep enough in it that the walls are the only thing you can see. My phone was on the nightstand. I did not pick it up. I lay there in the gray November dark and felt for the first time since Elena the precise cost of being the person who always knows when to leave before they're left, and the specific, structural grief of having left before you were asked to go. I have a drawer in my drafting table that I don't open often. It's the bottom left one, the deep kind, and it contains things that don't belong anywhere else in the organizational system of my apartment. Things that have weight without function, that I keep without being able to fully justify the keeping. A postcard from Barcelona that I bought myself on the last day of the conference where I met Elena. A mechanical pencil that belonged to my father, who was also an architect, who taught me to read a blueprint before I could ride a bicycle, who died when I was 26 in the quiet and inadequate way that people die when their hearts simply decide to stop, without drama, without warning, without the courtesy of a reason. A photograph of Jade and me at the completion party for my first solo project, a community center in Pilsen that I had drawn and redrawn 17 times before it felt like truth. The drawer is the part of me that doesn't fit the system. I opened it on the 3rd morning of the 3rd week of Nora's silence, not looking for anything, just needing to look at things that had weight. At the bottom, under the postcard and the photograph, I found something I hadn't put there. A folded piece of paper, the small square kind that comes from a notepad. And when I opened it, I found a drawing in crayon. Blue and yellow, and the labored, careful lines of a child who is trying to make something accurate. 3 figures in front of a house. 1 tall, 1 medium, 1 small, with 2 uneven circles on either side of her head. Under the drawing, In handwriting that was clearly helped by an adult but executed by the child, were 3 words: Maya, our house. I sat on the floor of my home office and held that piece of paper and understood that Rosie had put it there. During the evening at my apartment 3 weeks before, when she and Nora had come for dinner, and Rosie had asked to see my drafting table, and I'd let her sit at it with paper and the set of colored pencils I kept for color-blocking site plans. I had not known she'd left it. I had not known it was there. I sat on the floor and held it for a long time, and the thing that moved through me was not sadness exactly, and not tenderness exactly. It was something more structural than either of those, something that felt like the moment a blueprint becomes a building, when the abstraction resolves into the thing itself, and you understand for the first time what you are actually making. Jade came over that Saturday. She let herself in with the key I'd given her 7 years ago, and which she has used approximately 4 times, always at the right moment, with the accuracy of someone who has calibrated her interventions over a decade of friendship. She brought coffee from the place on Damen that I refuse to admit is better than the place I usually go, and she set it on my kitchen counter without ceremony, and looked at my apartment with the assessing look of someone who is reading a space for what it says about the person living in it. My apartment was clean. Perfectly, specifically clean, in the way it gets when I am managing something by organizing everything around it. She looked at the drafting table, which had 3 projects on it simultaneously, which is 2 more than my usual load. She looked at the empty coffee cups lined up near the sink, rinsed and waiting to be dealt with. She looked at me. She said, "How long has it been?" I said 17 days. She said, "And you've talked to her?" I said no. She said, "And she's talked to you?" I said she'd sent a text on day 9, a short one, professional in its restraint, that said only that she'd received an extension on the Portland deadline, and that she hoped I was well. I had read it 40 times. I had not responded. Jade absorbed this information with the expression of someone who is deciding how direct to be, and then she decided, because she always decides in the same direction. She said, "Maya, what are you doing?" What I was doing. And I knew this. I had known it for 17 days with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who can read the blueprint of their own behavior, even when they can't change it, was performing the structural logic of self-protection so completely that I had made it indistinguishable from cruelty, not cruelty with intention. The worst kind, cruelty that arrives wrapped in reasonableness, in practicality, in the language of what makes sense. Jade sat across from me at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she said, "You told her to go. She asked you if it was real, and instead of answering, you told her to go." I said I had told her what was practical. Jade said, "You told her that her leaving was easier for you than her staying. That's what she heard. That's what you said." I started to say that wasn't what I meant, and Jade said, with the specific gentleness she reserves for moments when gentleness is the sharpest possible tool, "I know it's not what you meant. But Maya, what you mean and what you say have had a gap between them for as long as I've known you. And usually it doesn't cost you anything because you don't let anyone close enough to fall into it. You let her close enough." I looked at my coffee. I looked at Rosie's drawing, which I had taken from the office and placed on the kitchen table, which Jade had not commented on, but had clearly seen. "She has a daughter," I said. Jade said, "I know." "She had a plan," I said. "She had Portland." Jade said, "People change their plans, Maya. That's what plans are for, to change when something more important arrives." In Portland, on the same Saturday, Nora Vasquez was sitting in the OHSU administrative building with a pen in her hand and a contract on the table in front of her, and she was not signing it. This is something I learned later, reconstructed from what she told me in pieces over the weeks after everything resolved, and I include it here because it matters. Because the story of those 17 days is not only my story, not only the story of someone sitting on a floor holding a child's drawing and slowly understanding the weight of what they'd refused. It is also the story of a woman in Portland who had flown out for a 2-day visit to finalize a decision she thought she'd already made, who sat in a conference room with good institutional lighting and a view of the Willamette River, and who looked at the contract and felt, not reluctance, not uncertainty, but the specific, clarifying sensation of doing the right thing for the wrong reason. She told me she'd sat there for 20 minutes. The administrator had gotten her water. She'd thanked her for the water. She'd looked at the river. She'd thought about Rosie, who had told her 3 days earlier, with the unmediated accuracy of a child who has not yet learned to soften what is true. "Mama, I don't want to move again. I want to stay where Maya is." Nora had said carefully that Chicago wasn't permanent. Rosie had said, "Why not?" And Nora did not have an answer that was better than the question. She did not sign the contract. She thanked the administrator, who was gracious about it in the professional way of someone who has seen people change their minds before and understands it as data rather than insult. She flew back to Chicago on Sunday morning, and she told me later that she felt, on the plane, not relief exactly. Relief implies the removal of a burden you were carrying. And the thing Nora felt was more like the addition of something, the weight of a decision that had finally aligned with the direction she'd been moving, without knowing it. She landed at O'Hare at 11:15 on a Sunday morning. She texted me from the gate. The text said, "I'm back. I didn't sign." 3 words and a period. I read those words standing in my kitchen in the gray Sunday morning, still in the clothes I'd slept in, and felt them rearrange something that had been misaligned for 17 days. I picked up my phone. I set it down. I picked it up again. Jade was right. The gap between what I meant and what I said was the structural flaw, the thing that had been bearing weight it wasn't built for. And the only way to address a structural flaw is not to add more structure on top of it, but to go back to the foundation and rebuild from there. I knew this. I am an architect. Knowing is the easy part. The hard part is picking up the tools. I called Jade. She answered immediately, which meant she'd been waiting. I said, "I need to go to the office." She said, "That is the wrong answer, Maya." I said, "She texted. She's back. She didn't sign." Jade said, "Then why are you calling me and not her?" I said, "Because I need to think." Jade said, "You've had 17 days to think. You've thought enough. This is the part where you stop thinking and do the true thing." I sat with that phrase, "do the true thing," and recognized it immediately as the only advice I'd ever needed, and the one I was consistently most resistant to, because doing the true thing requires the specific courage of someone who has decided that being known is worth the risk of being left. And I had spent 11 years constructing an existence around the premise that the risk was not worth it. 11 years is a long time to be wrong about something. It is also not too long. I said, "I'm going to the office." Jade said, "Maya." I said, "She works near Lurie on Mondays. If I'm at Harmon and Voss tomorrow morning, she'll pass by the building on the way to the hospital. She always walks up Erie." There was a pause. Then Jade said, with the warmth of someone who has just understood something, "You've been paying attention." I said, "I pay attention to everything." She said, "I know. It's time you did something with it." I went to the office on Monday morning at 7. Not for the Logan Square project. Not for Dominique's proposal. Not for any of the 3 open schematics on my drafting table. I went because Erie Street was 2 blocks from the Harmon and Voss entrance, and Nora walked it every Monday at 8:20, and I had learned this the way I learn everything about spaces that matter to me, through repetition, through attention, through the slow accumulation of detail into knowledge. I stood at my desk and looked at the Logan Square drawings and did not see them. At 8:14, my phone buzzed. Not Nora, Marcus, about a contractor meeting. At 8:19, I went to the window that faced Erie and looked down at the street, which was full of the ordinary Monday morning traffic of a city that had no interest in my particular crisis. At 8:23, I saw her. Dark coat. The one with the collar that was always slightly wrong on one side. Walking fast, hands in pockets, head slightly down against the November wind, and then, as if the geometry of the moment had been arranged by someone with an understanding of timing I don't have, she stopped. She looked up. The building is glass on the lower floors, and I know from the physics of it that she could not have seen me clearly from the street. But she stopped. She looked at the building, and then she looked, with the specific directness I had learned to recognize as her most honest expression, at the window where I was standing. I did not think. That is the truest thing I can say about what happened next. For perhaps the first time in 11 years, I did not think. I left the window. I took the elevator because the stairs would have been faster, and I needed the 30-second interval to locate. Somewhere in the architecture of myself, the version of Maya Chen, who was not building walls, but taking them down, brick by brick, slowly, in full awareness of what the exposure felt like. The elevator opened on the lobby. The lobby doors were glass. Nora was standing on the other side of them with her collar still slightly wrong and her hands still in her pockets, and the expression of someone who had flown to Portland and back and not signed a contract and walked up Erie Street on a Monday morning with the understanding, possibly, that she was walking towards something rather than away from it. I pushed through the doors. The November air was cold and specific. She looked at me. I looked at her. Rosie was at school. The city was loud and indifferent around us. There was nothing between us except 17 days and everything we had not said and the full weight of what was true, which had been waiting, patiently, for one of us to stop building and start speaking. The cold hit me the way November cold in Chicago always hits, not gradually, not as a suggestion, but as a full structural fact, the kind of weather that has decided what it is and is not interested in negotiation. Nora was standing 4 feet from the lobby doors, with her coat collar still slightly wrong on the left side, and her hands still in her pockets, and her face doing the thing it did when she was holding something carefully. That quality of composed surface over moving interior that I had learned to read the way I read buildings, from the outside in, looking for where the load was actually being carried. 4 feet. The distance between us was 4 feet and 17 days, and everything I had not said on the phone when she'd asked me if it was real, and I had answered with the architecture of practicality instead of the truth underneath it. The city moved around us. A cab, 2 people with coffee cups, a dog pulling its leash toward something important. And none of it was the point. She looked at me. I looked at her. The November air made a brief cloud of my breath and dissolved it. And I thought, this is the moment. This is the one you don't build around. I said her name. Just that. Just Nora. And I heard in the single word everything I had been compressing for 17 days. Everything I had been compressing, if I was being structurally honest, for 11 years. She didn't move. She was watching me with the attention she gave to things that mattered, the full-face attention that didn't slide off surfaces, and I understood that she was giving me the room to say it. Not pushing, not retreating. Just standing in the cold on a Monday morning on Erie Street in Chicago, present and waiting, which is its own form of courage that I had not previously had the vocabulary to recognize because I had spent so long confusing withdrawal with dignity. I took the 2 steps that closed half the distance between us. I said, "What you asked me, on the phone, if it was real." She waited. I said, "It was the most real thing that has happened to me in 11 years. And I told you to go because I was afraid of what happens when something real ends. And I have. I have very sophisticated architecture for that fear, Nora. I have built structures around it that I confused for wisdom. And what I did to you with that fear was..." I stopped. The word I needed was not in my professional vocabulary. It was in the older vocabulary, the one I kept in the bottom drawer with the postcard and the pencil and the photograph. "It was wrong," I said. "Not practical, not reasonable. Wrong. And I'm sorry." The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. I know because I counted them the way I had counted the 17 days, with the involuntary precision of someone for whom measurement is both profession and defense mechanism, and who was, in this moment, entirely unable to defend against anything. Then Nora crossed the remaining 2 feet between us, and she put her hand against the side of my face. Not gently, not tentatively, but with the specific certainty of someone who has decided. And she said, "I know you were afraid. I was afraid too. I have been afraid since the bookstore, since you pulled out that chair, since Rosie took your hand on the sidewalk and I watched you not pull away." Her thumb moved slightly against my cheekbone. The cold made everything precise. "But I didn't go to Portland to take the job," she said. "I went to Portland to find out if I could. And I sat in that room with the contract in the river and I understood something." She paused. "I understood that I wasn't trying to decide between Portland and Chicago. I was trying to decide between the life I'd planned before you and the one that started making sense after." I put my hand over hers against my face, and I felt the warmth of it against the cold of the morning, and I thought about blueprints, and about how the best buildings are not the ones that went exactly according to plan, but the ones where the architect was honest about what the space actually needed and had the courage to revise. We stood on the sidewalk on Erie Street for longer than was practical, and neither of us cared. At some point she laughed, quietly, the full-body kind, the one I had been cataloging since the bookstore with the helpless attention of someone who has tried and failed to be clinical about a thing that is not clinical. She laughed, because a pigeon landed approximately 8 inches from our feet, and looked at us with the direct assessment of a creature that has seen everything and is impressed by none of it. And the absurdity of the pigeon in the middle of everything that was happening was exactly the kind of interruption that Nora found funny, and that I found funny, because she did. "Witness," she said to the pigeon. "Remember this." The pigeon left. We stayed. The morning moved around us, and we let it. And when she finally said she was going to be late for her shift, and I said I had a contractor meeting at 9:30, we separated with the reluctance of people who have just found solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing, and are not fully confident yet in the physics of it. She turned back once, at the corner. I was still watching. She knew I would be. "Dinner," she said. "Tonight, all 3 of us." Not a question. Not quite. The same construction as Rosie's "okay" when I'd told her the PHO might be the best soup in the world. A decision delivered as a closing statement. "All 3 of us," I said. And she turned the corner, and I stood in the cold for another moment before going back. The weeks that followed had the quality of a building coming into use for the first time. That specific period when the structure you designed encounters the actual behavior of the people inside it, and you discover which things you got exactly right, and which things require adjustment, and which things turn out to be better than you planned. Because human beings are more inventive and more resilient than any blueprint can fully anticipate. Nora had called the hospital in Portland with the professional composure that was her version of the armoring I used in my own field, and she had declined the position, and she had then spent a week in quiet negotiation with Lurie Children's Hospital about converting her temporary placement into a permanent one, which they had been considering offering her anyway, according to her department head, who had apparently been hoping she'd stay since October. She told me this with the dry, delighted humor she used for things that should have been obvious sooner. "He said he'd been waiting for me to ask," she said. Apparently, I was the last one to realize I was already home. I heard that word, home, and felt it settle in me the way structural things settle. Quietly, with permanence, without requiring acknowledgement to be true. Dominique and I had a meeting the Wednesday after Erie Street. Professional and direct. The kind of conversation that 2 people can have when they know each other's full dimensions and have decided where the boundary of the professional lives in relation to everything else. She was, as she had always been, exact. She said the project offer was genuine and separate. She said she was glad I hadn't done what she'd suspected I was about to do, which was use the project as a reason not to deal with the personal thing I was clearly in the middle of. I said I appreciated that. She said, "She's good for you. She makes you look less like a building and more like a person." I said I was going to pretend that was a compliment. She said, "It was." We shook hands at the end of the meeting. The project moved forward, professionally and cleanly, and it was the right decision. And I understood in it the particular satisfaction of two things being exactly what they were, without apology or confusion. Which is, in my experience, the rarest and most stable kind of architecture. The apartment changed. That's the simplest way to say it, and simplicity is the correct register for something this structural. Not all at once, not dramatically, not in the way of a renovation that announces itself with dust and displacement. The way a space changes when it begins to be lived in by more people than it was holding before. Rosie's drawings appeared on my refrigerator, attached with a magnet from a museum she'd visited on a school trip, and I did not move them. A small pair of shoes appeared near my door, with the haphazardness of someone who removes them mid-movement, going somewhere more important than shoe organization, and I did not move them either. Nora's reading glasses appeared on my nightstand one Thursday evening and stayed through the weekend, and I found, on Sunday morning, that I had moved them slightly so they wouldn't fall, which is the kind of care that doesn't announce itself as significant and is entirely significant. My mornings changed shape. Not all of them. I still had the window and the coffee and the silence I needed to assemble myself. But some mornings the silence had company in it. The presence of someone else's breathing. Someone else's movement in the kitchen. And I discovered that I had been wrong about what I needed. Or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. Which in architectural terms is the more interesting problem because incompleteness implies the possibility of addition rather than the finality of error. The Sunday I am thinking of. The one that stays clearest. The one I return to when I want to understand what it feels like to have built something true. Was 6 weeks after Erie Street. Gray cold. The particular Chicago December that smells of wood smoke and impending snow. I was at my drafting table with a new project. A small community library in Bridgeport, the kind of project that will never be in a journal, but that will matter to the specific 3,000 people who use it every year, which is the kind of mattering I had recently relearned to value. Nora was somewhere behind me. I could hear her making coffee. I could hear the specific sound of her in a kitchen, which I had memorized without intending to the way you memorize things that become load-bearing. And Rosie was at the kitchen table with paper and the colored pencils, working on something with the focused authority she brought to all her projects, narrating quietly to herself in the half-voice of a person fully absorbed. At some point she held up the drawing she'd made and said, to both of us and to neither of us, to the apartment itself, "Look, I made our family." Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway with 2 cups of coffee and looked at the drawing, and then she looked at me. And her face did the thing I had first seen at the bookstore, and had since learned to translate accurately. Not the managed surface, but the real face. The one that simply happened when she was in the presence of the people she loved most. I looked at Rosie's drawing, 3 figures, house, the same crayon colors as the one she'd left in my drawer. And this time the figures were holding hands. The tall one, and the medium one, and the small one with the 2 uneven circles. And I felt, moving through me with the quiet authority of a structure that has been correctly built and is now bearing exactly the weight it was designed for. Something I want to name accurately, because accuracy is the discipline I trust most. It was not relief. It was not the removal of a fear. It was not the resolution of a problem or the closing of a chapter or the arrival at any destination I had previously charted. It was something that felt, instead, like the moment after a building is finished and the scaffolding comes down. That particular morning, when what you designed is fully visible for the first time, standing in the light, holding its own weight, exactly what it was always meant to be. Nora put a cup of coffee on the corner of my drafting table, and her hand rested briefly on my shoulder. Just a moment, the duration of a breath. And Rosie was already drawing the next thing, narrating again, and the December light came through the east window at the angle that makes everything look possible, and I sat at my drafting table in my apartment that was no longer arranged for one, in my life that no longer fit perfectly inside the lines I had drawn for it, and I understood that this was not a compromise. This was the revision, the one that happens when you are honest enough about what a space needs to let go of the first blueprint and draw something true. I put my hand over Nora's where it rested on my shoulder. She left it there. Outside, the first snow of December was beginning. Quiet, specific, indifferent to everything except the fact of its own falling. And inside, in the room I had spent 11 years designing for one, we were 3, and the walls were standing, and the light was good.